Let me start by reacting to one thing that EJ said. I've been pretty much involved in this evangelical Catholic dialogue since the beginning, since we convened it. And I've benefited from getting to know two people in this process. I benefited from getting to know John Carr and Ron Sider as people who have very strong political views, but for whom ideology is not primary, and for whom ideology is not a barrier to fellowship. And so I've personally benefited in many ways from seeing an example of that. These are some exceptional people, and that in itself is a contribution. And there are many other, it could be said of many of the other people involved in this effort, people who are willing to take on their own team when the demands of conscience lead them in that direction. And that is particularly rare in our political environment, and it needs to be more common. I'll just respond to a few things before we get into a discussion. I find myself in fairly rare agreement with EJ on a lot of the analysis part here. It's nice to begin on a kind of a level ground of agreement. In this, what we're seeing right now, I would add a few elements, but if you step back 20 years, you have seen both the evangelical and Catholic vote in America. Now you can disaggregate that in a variety of different ways, but white Catholics and white evangelicals have become more Republican over the last 20 years, both groups. Okay. Evangelicals, their support for Republicans, whenever it has peaked higher than the previous peak. And it achieved its highest point in 2004 with George W. Bush. There are troughs in between, but this is a group that's firmly anchored in the Republican coalition. I think there are a variety of reasons for that, but it's become more Republican over time. White Catholics, I've seen a similar dynamic, but a smaller one with more variation from election to election. At least, at every spike there, it's often been a little higher than the previous Republican spike. In particular, you've seen a dynamic where people that attend church more regularly, more committed in their tradition, have voted more Republican over time. You also see a dynamic by which the numbers on regular attendance are higher among evangelicals than they are among Catholics, which I think skews some of that data. This election is very much in flux. Evangelical support for Romney is not where it was with George W. Bush in 2004. It's about what it was with John McCain in the kind of 73 to 75% range. So that's good, but it's not anywhere near kind of the Republican high end when it comes to that. There is among evangelicals an intensely unfavorable view of Barack Obama. There is not a commensurately intense view in favor of Mitt Romney. And there are lingering concerns, I believe, on Mormonism at the margins. But I think we also have to take seriously that some of the concern is a distrust of how committed Romney is on social issues because of his background. So some of it is not just religious, but also a distrust on culturally conservative issues in this context. The white Catholics have a majority in support for Romney. I talked with John Green earlier today on a different issue. He says it's higher than the norm right now. And he was making the case, which is an interesting one, that in the polling, that Catholics are actually the most favorable religious group to Mormons. And that was true in the Republican primaries, and it's true more broadly. And he says that that's a cultural memory of the way Catholics were treated in American life. And so there's a much closer identification with Mormonism than there is among evangelicals, which could be an advantage to Romney that's an unexpected advantage, and which he saw, of course, when he was running against two Catholic opponents in the primaries and regularly got large majorities of the Catholic vote in the Republican primaries. So that's an interesting dynamic. Talking to John just about what he thought was taking place in among this subset that could be quite important that you're talking about in Ohio, among regular church attenders who are Catholic, who consider themselves independent or democratic leaning. There's not a lot of good poll data on this. He says his anecdotal impression is that they're deeply conflicted. Okay? That there's a significant concern about religious liberty issues and the way that those arguments have moved forward, and a significant concern that Mitt Romney has no rooting in a social justice argument or tradition. Doesn't talk about the poor. So there's his anecdotal view is that there's a significant internal conflict going on there. And as you say, this could be important. We've got a national election that will be largely decided on economic issues. That's what people report overwhelmingly as their main electoral concern. But that does not mean that various groups of voters in key battleground states cannot assume disproportionate importance in the context of a close election. And that could put cultural issues very much in the fore. And that could be on both sides. A lack of enthusiasm by evangelicals in Florida could make a difference, okay, as far as turnout and other things. Or a concern among church-going independent Catholics in Ohio or Wisconsin or Iowa or Pennsylvania or a lot of other places could make a significant difference. Now, I'll proceed to say something a little more controversial, just to add a little element here of disagreement. I think it's fair to say that 4 years ago, that Barack Obama consciously set out to fight that long-term trend of the sorting of the parties by religious intensity. So that he made specific outreach to evangelicals. His call to renewal speech was really one of the best of its type that he gave at Jim Wallace's group. It was really an excellent effort. He, I think, made significant outreach to Catholics as well. His tone was a unifying national tone. And he made marginal gains. I think you're right. You don't make dramatic gains from, for the most part, unless there's some defining issue. But he made marginal gains in both of those groups. I think that there's very little evidence right now in the electoral process that the Obama campaign is fighting that long-term trend. In fact, I think that some elements are embracing it. So you see I forget his first name, but Heilman in his New York Magazine article, Tom Heilman, coming out recently, about how some operatives within the Obama orbit are influenced by this idea of demographics versus economics, okay? That they want to ride, essentially, the growing, what's called the coalition of the ascendant, which is minorities, socially liberal, college-educated whites, especially women and young voters. And so David Plouffe has a quote in this article saying, "Let's be clear what Romney would do as president. Potentially abortion will be criminalized, women will be denied contraceptive services, he's far right on immigration, he supports effort to amend the Constitution to ban gay marriage." So another operative says, he's the 50s. he's retro, he's backward, and we're forward. That's the basic construct. If you're a woman, you're Hispanic, you're young, you've gotten left out, you look at Romney and say, this effing guy is going to take us back to the way it always was. Okay? I'd make a couple of observations about that. One of them is that that's the definition of a culture war argument, dividing people by culture war issues. It's Romney that wants to talk about economics in this election and in fact constantly tries to avoid engaging on these type of issues. And so, second, I think that the evidence is that David Plouffe and David Axelrod are not engaged in a particularly sophisticated outreach to religious voters. There's not much for more traditional or conservative evangelicals or Catholics to find that's encouraging in the current discourse and agenda of the Obama campaign. Not very much to make people feel welcome. And I think the worst crime that they're engaged in is making EJ's life more difficult in trying to explain these trends. That to me is the question is whether the Democratic Party is fighting these long-term trends by which the parties sort by ideology and religious intensity, or whether it's contributing to them. And I'd make the argument that we've entered a phase where at least a significant portion of the Democratic Party has decided that the coalition of the future is not the New Deal coalition that included white Catholics and evangelicals, many evangelicals. And maybe that's a realistic recognition, but it might have consequences in Ohio and other places that are hard to foresee. I think I've taken my time, but I'll respond to one other thing about what some of the trends within evangelicalism that I've seen, and why there is a serious appeal, for example, to the Tea Party and some other elements here. So, our dialogue is very important, but not representative in a certain way, because there's a significant portion of the evangelical community that, if you look, for example, in the Iowa caucuses, the most recent Iowa caucuses, a significant portion of Ron Paul's support was evangelical in Iowa. So I would only respond to just to open a discussion that I think that there is this history that EJ talks about. I went to Wheaton College. There's a room at Wheaton College. Jonathan Blanchard was the abolitionist founder of Wheaton College. There's a room at Wheaton College that was intended to be the throne room of Christ when he returned, because he was a postmillennialist. And he thought that by acts of social engagement and fighting slavery, and he also fought for blue laws and against secret societies and a lot of other things that were popular among evangelicals at the time, that he was helping to usher in the kingdom. And it was not an individualistic view. But that changed really significantly in the fundamentalist modernist controversy beginning in the 1920s, which was really the breakup of the liberal coalition, okay, between people like William Jennings Bryan and more secular liberal elites, where secular liberal elites turned with a vengeance on evangelical engagement. People like the journalist Jack Reed or the Clarence Darrow or others. And you had a broad retreat of evangelicals from public engagement. And when they re-entered politics, they had a different political history. And they reemerged in opposition to government intervention. So the first big issue for many evangelicals was the attempt during the Carter administration, an evangelical president, to regulate religious schools. Okay? And it was not abortion initially that was the driver for a lot of evangelical outrage when it came to this. But then came Roe v. Wade and there had previous school prayer decisions. And it created a deep suspicion of government involvement that is not really true of Catholicism in many ways in the political history of the United States. And I still see that all the time. When I push on issues like development assistance, support for development assistance, evangelicals they often have the institutions that implement development programs, World Vision or other things. They have a deep sympathy for those concerns, and they also have a deep suspicion in government's role. And so I guess my response would be that to some extent the argument is not, the basic argument there is not theological, but a matter of political philosophy. And I don't think that evangelicals have effectively defined a political philosophy that allows a positive but limited role for government. And it's one of the real challenges in approaching a lot of these different issues. But just some random thoughts.